Good afternoon. Everybody have a nice lunch? It's always, a nice lighthearted topic to be discussing at lunch. Yeah, I was thinking while I was sitting there, and it's not
Mr.
often that I
Kleinman,
think.
excuse me for one quick moment, Mr. Kleinman, I apologize, but I believe you were not, there's a caution, for legal reasons, we need to provide a note of caution before you begin. I don't think you were here this morning.
Oh,
when it
what
was
caution
said.
is
So
that? That
I'm going to turn it over
I'm
to
exceptionally
Mr.
boring?
Klein.
Or?
Despite
He's known
that,
to put people to sleep?
despite that, as you're well aware, obviously being an intelligence officer, that this is an open forum, and that the use of, or even the close use of classified information is to be, be careful of that, and be mindful of obviously the federal law and the classification rules in the U.S. government. Not to be insulting, but it's just a caution.
Sure. No, caution noted. Thank you very much for the reminder. As somebody who's protected the nation's secret for 33 years, I haven't heard that for the first time. So anyway, while I was thinking, I wanted to make that point that he thinks. While I was sitting there, I noticed a citizen-led truth seeking. That is the strength of America. We talk about a free press being so important to democracy. Beyond the press, it's this. And related to that, let's not conflate torture and interrogation, because interrogation, in my view, and Mark Fallon, my brother here, will back me up, what interrogation actually is, it's truth-seeking to understand. And if that's your purpose, then torture is absolutely out the window. It's not even a consideration beyond the very considerable legal issues and certainly the profound moral issues. Just on an operational level, if that's what you want, to understand, seek truth to understand, you would not use any of these horrific methods. So, but having said that, let me start with this quote. Waterboarding is a minor form of torture. Some people say it's not actually torture. I'm not going to give any hints, but they ask the question, what do you think of waterboarding? Absolutely fine. But we should go much stronger than waterboarding. That's the way I feel. And don't tell me it doesn't work. Torture works, okay, folks? Believe me, it works. I did an interview with a Canadian radio station. They said, was the president lying? No, he's not lying. He's talking about something for which he has no knowledge, no personal experience, no expertise whatsoever. But yet, he's making those claims. And too many people that support torture make unsubstantiated claims. And I'm going to try to substantiate my claim to that as I speak. In 1985 really is when I started getting involved with interrogation. And never for a moment would I have ever imagined this country would get to the point where the topic of interrogation and how we treat detainees would be the canary in the moral coal mine that would speak about our collective soul. But it has. I guess it's because it's all about what you do when nobody is looking and what you do with people who are absolutely defenseless. And we've heard some people, their experiences with the tales we've heard this morning. But not only have our values, but really our beliefs have been tortured over the last few years. There's a fascinating study in the Journal of Experimental Psychology called Tortured Beliefs, How and When Prior Support for Torture Skews the Perceived Value of Coerced Information. To summarize that study, it was interesting. Number one, people who are torture advocates, they are quick to believe that any information obtained that way is valuable and necessary for national security purposes. Whereas people who aren't supporters, who are opposed, they have an open mind. It could be good or it could be bad. It's still the process. And I have to quote one of our mutual friends, Tom Neer, a career FBI agent and NCIS agent, who once said about torture, well, people point out these cherry-picked scenarios where information value was obtained. And he said, even a blind squirrel will find a nut from time to time. And that's about as best as it gets. So, but the other thing is people who are advocates of torture will find these rare moments of maybe some lucidity that was gained through torture, and that'll be their success story. Even when in many cases we can prove that the information was already gained elsewhere through more moral and legitimate purposes. The other thing is but the people who support torture, they will think that it is useful and the information obtained is accurate and reliable as long as we're interrogating Al-Qaeda. The same scenario, switch it where Al-Qaeda is using exactly the same methods, they will say that information was coerced and worthless. And that, oh, by the way, it's wrong to do that. There can't be multiple standards of behavior for humans. They're not on this earth, not on any other planet where we might find human life. I was going to say intelligent life, but I'm kind of wondering these days with political discourse. Here's another challenge we have. Unlike technical means of intelligence collection, which is all about precision and science, interrogation is based on customary knowledge, meaning passed down so-called lessons learned without any means of objectively evaluating their usefulness, their utility in the real world, and the lack of precision. We've already heard today one of the official definitions of torture. It used the term, it characterized pain as what? Severe. Okay, each of you pull out a 3x5 card and define for me with precision what severe means. It depends on who you are. If you slapped me in the face, that would hurt a little bit. If I just had dental work, it would hurt a lot. Does that change? So using these imprecise terms of severe and characterizing subjective terms is just literally useless, and it's only used for those who want to advocate the blackest of the black activities. We don't use, when we talk about geosynchronous orbit, we don't talk about the satellite has to be high but not too high. I mean, we'll talk literally about 22,300 miles in space. So what I plan to do here, my intention, I think I'm definitely, if you're looking for an example of preaching to the choir, I'm sure this is it. But I want to give you ammunition when you go forward and you engage with people about torture and interrogation, the efficacy of torture, and why it's not only unnecessary but often counterproductive. And I hope you use these. Everything I say, I promise you, I can provide a source for beyond myself. I'm not going to ask you to believe me because I have 30 plus years in the business, because there are other people with 30 plus years who think in a very, very different way. So we have come a long way about our understanding. The high value detainee interrogation group has been absolutely instrumental in providing support for actual research, empirical research to understand what underpins a useful interrogation. Before that, before about 7 years ago, the last time we really invested in learning about it was 1956. Could you imagine any other, whether it's forensic science or whether it's intelligence, relying on science from several generations ago? We wouldn't accept it, but we somehow do. The bar for what we accept in interrogation is quite low. But again, believe me, it works. What we have on one side is researchers who provide substantial data in peer-reviewed journals to make their case about what is useful, like a rapport building, positive conversational skills, adaptation, autonomy. And those who are proponents of torture, they will provide books. They will not provide a single shred of data to support what they're saying. It's just believe me. Look at my title and believe me. And oh, by the way, don't look too deeply in my past, because somehow I've been associated with torture that I'm not trying to defend. So let's compare, if you will, just a few items I think that are central to the argument about interrogation, what works, and torture that doesn't. And again, I'm not going to conflate the two. An interrogator that tortures is not interrogating. They are torturing. Those are two very, very separate, very distinctly different pursuits. So let's talk about the most fundamental issue when you're interrogating somebody. Where does the information reside? They're not going to hand you a note, not going to hand you your laptop. It's in their memory. And the scientific literature on memory is very robust, and it tells us several things. Memory is fallible and it's fragile. But also, we learned that there are mnemonic devices that can actually enhance somebody's ability to recall. But mind you, they must be cooperative. You can't force somebody to recall. If I could force you to recall things, everyone in here would be an A student. You just hire me to yell at you or sleep deprive you or waterboard you to remember. But it doesn't work. And when you put it on that level, I think it starts to make sense. Thanks for the laugh, my friend. We got a little sign here. So, strategic principle one, everything you do as an interrogator must be designed to preserve and enhance memory. Now let's look at torture. Again, I talked about the robust literature, about the challenges, environmental pressures, interpersonal pressures, and let's think about those specifically. Being kept awake for 5 days, we just heard from Ms. Pitter, or the threats, the anxiety, the circadian rhythm disruptions, waterboarding. We know that's going to undermine memory, but that's exactly what torture is. So you have to challenge somebody who's a proponent of torture. Is your intention to hurt somebody? Then you got it right. If your intention is to elicit the best possible memory, you've got it awfully wrong. And let me back up a second. Let me explain what the sophisticated definition of an objective of interrogation is, and that is this. It is the fullest possible disclosure of the best possible recall. If you keep that in mind, that'll shape everything you do. getting somebody to recall as broadly and as deeply as possible with the greatest amount of accuracy. And that's a very difficult challenge. Okay. The second part, interrogation seeks to elicit and sustain cooperation. Because I've already said you need cooperation to access somebody's memory. You can't force your way in there. So what we found through research and field validation studies, which also reflects probably the best practices seen among the highest performing professionals out there, and that is things that you've probably heard, especially if you're in the health services. Motivational interviewing provides 5 pillars that are really, really helpful. From autonomy, let them talk about what they want to talk about. Adapting to that, right? Evoking their desires, their fears, their motivations, right? Showing empathy, and it's not sympathy. That's a different undertaking altogether. But empathy, that you appreciate who they are, that they're human, you'll treat them that way, right? What else? These immediacy. I mean, the simple gestures that we have when we're talking, at a cocktail party or a close friend, to let people know you're listening. It all comes under active listening. Now, I know this sounds, to some, especially those who would promote a more coercive model, as that would never work. Well, I'm going to get to you with proof of why it does and how. Now, how does torture overcome resistance? Just the opposite. We've already heard about it. The EITs, the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, which I don't like to use because they're not enhanced at all. It's a degradation of the process. But it's based on a long history of torture. I mean, America was not the one who invented it, but we just brought it into the 21st century. And there was a document put out by the CIA in the 50s and 60s called the Kubark Manual, which was essentially, the first half was actually reasonable. It talks about many similar things about understanding culture, be able to develop rapport. And then it's one of those, if that doesn't work, then, and it tries to achieve 3 goals. Remember, my goal is the fullest possible disclosure of the best possible recall. Their goal is debility, dependence, and dread. Debility means break somebody down physically, psychologically, and emotionally to the point they can't resist. Develop a dependence, a superior power differential between the interrogator and the detainee, so that the detainee feels like they have to respond to every whim, and they'll do whatever they're told, including tell you that there's WMD in Iraq, or that Al-Qaeda was aligned with the Iraqi intelligence service, which we know are not true, but they'll tell you that if that's what you want to force them to say. And then finally, dread, that, things are okay now because you're talking, but the moment you stop, we're going to go back down in even a deeper, darker rabbit hole. But what does research tell you about that? Threats, humiliation will create in-group and out-group boundaries, which are very strong, and they drive our behavior. We have a tribal mindset. I mean, it's part of, I think, being humans. And that is, we connect with certain people. It could be a family. It could be literally a tribe. It could be an organization. It could be a nationality. When you attack that, I reach and I create stronger attachments than ever before with people like me. And I see people like you as the enemy, and I'll do everything to resist you. So when they try to use these methods to break down resistance, they are, in fact, enhancing it. They're increasing the resistance, which, again, it's counterproductive. I don't quite understand it. So let's look at a little bit about history. I mentioned about the case studies. There are a number of people who were very, very gifted. They got information where nobody could get information, and they did it in a very unique way. My master's thesis was on a World War II interrogation program. That ringing comes back. It was about this World War II interrogation program where they were very, very effective. They were very effective. And I talked to some of the survivors. They're obviously by then in the 80s and 90s. But one gentleman put it this way. He said, I engaged in a battle of wits with these people, with these hardened Nazis, who many of them were responsible for the Holocaust. But I engaged with a battle of wits. I never laid a hand on them. I got my mission accomplished, and I kept my humanity. I thought, what a great standard. What a great standard for today. But let me give you some examples. Hans Scharf was a German interrogator. He's well known. He was friendly, and he had this encyclopedic knowledge that he was able to use and leverage. He never threatened anybody. He stayed in contact with, was good friends with many of the Americans that he interrogated. I don't imagine the people we talked to today, we heard their testimony, want to stay in touch and exchange Christmas cards with anybody that dealt with them. Also in World War II, Sherwood Moran, who had been a missionary in Japan, spoke the language flawlessly, understood the intricate and complex social structure that is Japan, and was able to engage and be successful. And again, he never, ever threatened anybody. He called it sympathetic common sense. And that's really a definition of empathy. The common sense part, these are the enemy. There are people dying, and we need to get information. But I sympathize. I can reach out to these people. Colonel Stuart Harrington, an Army colonel in Vietnam, in Panama, and also in Desert Storm, used what he called this guest house. I mean, he made people feel comfortable. He kept them protected. He never threatened them. And yet, in fact, his unique style was trust building. Not only just showing that I'll trust you, I'm showing that you can trust me. A lot of people never think about trust in the context. And finally, our own Mark Fallon, who's sitting right here in the second row, my brother, as an NCIS agent who'd done hundreds of interrogations and led a number of the most celebrated counterterrorism cases, how did he do it? He built an encyclopedic knowledge of the people, of the groups, of the capabilities. Then he sat down and engaged with respect for each individual's humanity. All these people, they have empathy, they have self-control, they see the larger picture, and they keep their humanity, which is pretty impressive. So how do I know some of this works? It seems all nice, because we've heard, I think one congressman saying, what do we either torture or we serve them tea and crumpets? Now I'm thinking somebody is serving our national interest with that limited of imagination. Those are the two distinct choices. I don't think so. I don't think so at all. What we have is a situation where there was 1,200 hours of interviews with extreme right-wing, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and paramilitary groups in the United Kingdom. And they looked at it and they coded for behaviors on the part of both the interrogators and the detainees. And what they found was those that displayed autonomy, adaptation, evocation, empathy, they resulted in an increase in not only the volume, but the quality of the information, and also simultaneously decreased the number of counter-interrogation strategies, that is, resistance. It's pretty amazing. Then again, what do we know from torture? Well, we know this. This question came up twice for speakers this morning, and I'm going to address it unasked. But what is the history of this? Where did this all come from? This is the story, and you should know it. I used to be the Department of Defense Senior Intelligence Officer for what we call Special Survival Training, which mainly meant resistance to interrogation if somebody was captured by terrorist groups or another government that was not a signatory to the Geneva Convention. So we used to teach them in very austere, very threatening conditions because we had to give them an idea, and we also filled them with strategies how to deal with it. So here's the deal. We would present interrogation strategies that were drawn from our studies of what was known as the communist interrogation model, because we wanted to make it as realistic as possible. And so who did we model? We modeled the Soviet Union. I mentioned Soviet Union, it chose a date. North Korea, North Vietnam, and China. We said this is what's going to possibly happen, and this is how you can deal with it. But here is the United States government doctrine on that, because I used to teach it. First of all, we used to teach those interrogation methods are immoral, that only a totalitarian government that doesn't care about international law would employ them. Number two, they're illegal. They're illegal by any stretch, and very few countries in the world have abrogated that responsibility. And here's the key part. Remember, we're using these now, these EITs, for the purpose of collecting intelligence. We used to teach, as a matter of doctrine, that those methods are primarily useful for achieving two outcomes. Number one is producing propaganda. Number two is extracting false confessions. Now, if we had an information spectrum up here, and you had intelligence over here, false confessions and propaganda would be at the far end of that spectrum. It just makes no sense. And it doesn't change because which country is actually employing them. I chalk that up to the things that make you go, So here's a couple final notes. Common Article 3. I've heard this argument over and over again. We can't constrain our interrogators. Based on what we know from science, from field validation studies, and the case studies of the most successful interrogators out there, Common Article 3 is not restrictive. It's a guidepost to what works well to get information without the strategic costs involved. So I'm going to conclude with three quotes I think are apropos from Napoleon. First of all, he says, in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. So I don't care how many drone strikes we have. I don't care how many boots on the ground. It doesn't matter. It's the morality that's ultimately going to either help you succeed or fail miserably. You know, we always talk about winning hearts and minds. Napoleon was thinking about that long before he would. Here's the other interesting thing. What then, generally speaking, is the truth of history? Nothing more than a fable agreed upon. So you know what? There's a fable out there that we needed to interrogate / torture people, keep in unlimited, undefined detention, and then if we release them with these draconian restrictions, let us not let that be the history of America. Let the history be America, be people in this room and other rooms around the country that are standing up and trying to find the truth so we can understand a better way forward. And the only way to look forward is to look back. Finally, as we think about our place in history, I mean as a nation, we have challenges before us. And how we deal with this issue cannot be overstated, because Napoleon warned us that we can go from the sublime to the ridiculous in a single step. Thank you. Before you ask questions, know that I'm also trained in resistance to interrogation.
Commissioner Wilkerson.
What is it that causes, in poll after poll, 50 to 55% of Americans to, depending on how the question is couched, agree that torture might be useful or is useful? Is it cowardice? Is it ignorance? Is it our venality and brutality inherent to our tribe, if you will? What is it that causes half of America to see everything that you've just said as being so much rhetoric and torture works? Is it Jack Bauer? Is it TV? Is it movies?
Okay, you got all four. I was going to add propaganda, which is essentially 24. You know, everybody. I've testified for Congress 5 times. I've literally had your representatives. One time they actually said, "But we see on 24." Now this is probably my 3rd or 4th time, so probably wasn't the most most respectful response. But I said, "Sir, if we're going to take our guidance from television, then if somebody in your family needs major thoracic surgery, I recommend you watch MASH, because Alan Alda was on there. You could call him, because not only do you save lives, we get this snappy repartee." I just read a research piece that I don't like to divide people too much by labels, but the research was very clear. People who are very conservative, and unfortunately the conservative movement has embraced torture as necessary for national security. Those people have larger portions of their amygdala, which deals with fear. They are fearful. And sir, I've heard you talk about our former vice president. We did this because we're fear of the next attack, for fear of this. And you very, very astutely said, we're led by some very fearful people. And we can't be fearful. You know, doing the right thing takes courage. It takes boldness. But the other part too, I mean, and forgive me for even raising this, but I think it's an important and mysterious question. Those numbers you mentioned, people who are, quote, of faith, who attend religious ceremonies on a regular basis, even a higher proportion think under certain circumstances we should torture. I don't understand it. This is Zimbardo potential. And before any of us get too smug, I warn you from personal experience that within your circle of friends or professional acquaintances, under the wrong circumstances, they will shock you. I mean, my early years, we used to do these field exercises out in Korea with American and South Korean troops. This was just a training exercise. Without getting too graphic, I'll just give you one example. I had to walk in a room and order a soldier to stand down because he had a South Korean soldier with his pants down around his ankles, had his wrist shackled to his ankles, and he was threatening to sodomize him if he didn't talk. And this was prologue for me. Why in the hell are you doing this? Because it's the only thing that works. I hear that all the time. It's the only thing that works. They believe that. So they forget all the training. But imagine, sir, I mean, with your military experience, you'll appreciate this. What if when Al-Qaeda was trying to Didi Mao out of Afghanistan and we're in Tora Bora, we used some serious kinetic weaponry to try to take them out, and those bunker busters weren't working. Would biological or chemical weapons have done the trick? The answer is yes. So why didn't we do that and say, look, we were doing it in the interest of the country? Because it was so morally repulsive and had such profound strategic consequences that we couldn't. I would argue that torture is the biological and chemical equivalent in the intelligence world. So, but it's that Zimbardo potential, I think. Some people just, my friend Mark tells us, I mean, in his story, if you haven't read Unjustified Means, it chronicles a path in the to the dark side that's just unprecedented. But his experience parallels mine. There's some people who just want to do it, and they want to find a reason for it. Thank you for the question. Did I scare you away?
I have a question. You referenced in-groups and out-groups.
Yes.
And I wonder if you believe that perpetrators of torture, if there's any hope for them to be rehabilitated.
Good question. I had forgive me, I forgot who it was I was discussing with. Oh, yes, there, in the back row. We were talking about the emotional, psychological baggage that comes when somebody's ordered to torture. It's an unlawful order, and they should stop. But I get that when I did it, I was a lieutenant colonel. It's different if you're a specialist or an airman and you have some very senior ranking person. But nonetheless, people are torturing because they're told to or because they decided to. If there's any shred of humanity in them, at one point they're going to have to be dealing with that, having to square that. And I mean, Viktor Frankl wrote about this in Man's Search for Meaning. He had the freedom, even though they were torturing him. But those who were torturing would always be locked into that. I work with some police departments trying to teach them a more rapport built. I mean, really, they connect with people. And so now they're challenging me, hey, sometimes our methods are good in exonerating somebody, but also sometimes they're very good in getting enough information to help convict somebody, and they go away to prison for a long time. And they're away from their they see the whole picture. They've connected. And there's that emotional bond that has now been shattered. So how do they deal with that? So yeah, it's hard to get people to, when it's cognitive dissonance. If you've publicly spoken in favor of something or more emphatically been involved, it's hard to ever say, oh yeah, that was awful, I shouldn't have done that. But I know of a number of people, a small number of people in the military who have come completely to the light, if you will, and are absolutely, they're always going to be dealing with the profound effects of their being involved with torture. So, and talking about in-group, out-group, if I can take it one step further, if we want to win this ideological battle, we can't diminish, we can't do what we're telling them not to do. We can't humiliate, we can't dehumanize people because they support torture. I think it's absolutely, and everybody in this room, it's awful. Anybody who did it almost does not deserve the next breath. But if we want to deal with it, we need to find a way to connect. We need to come up with a more powerful narrative as why it's not necessary and make it easy for them and reward them for it and not remind them where they were. Does that answer your...
Mr. Kleinman, I have a question from the audience, and I have my own question as well. So there's a question from the audience about what you recommend that we should recommend to begin to shift the norms and our understanding about the use of torture. And then on top of that, I'm also curious as to how you deal with the comments that one often hears that, oh, I'm against torture, but if there were a ticking time bomb, then I would want to torture.
Okay, can I answer them in reverse order?
Yep.
The ticking time bomb is a statistically improbable event. In fact, based on my knowledge and intelligence and the broad network, there's never truly been one of those instances. So we're creating policy based on the most, again, statistically improbable event, and we let the not the probable, but the reality right in front of us suffer the consequences. Here's the deal. We spend about $75 billion a year in this country on intelligence. Every year, $75 billion. Let's put that in context. The United Kingdom spends about that or a little bit less on their entire defense force. And they're still a major power. But if we are in a situation where it comes down, the safety and security of a major American city comes down to whether we torture somebody or not, I'm thinking, talk about epic failure on a strategic level and talk about not getting your money's worth. That they're leaving us so vulnerable that we would have to torture somebody. And here's the other problem with torture. How do you know they know? How do you know they know? That's the mystery. There's puzzles and mysteries in intelligence. That's a mystery. And if you already knew what they knew, you wouldn't need to talk to them in the first place. So now, let's see, the other one, how do we learn more? Well, the good part is none of this is classified. I mean, what we're talking about interrogation, all the research sponsored by the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group is unclassified. We have this great website that certain agencies are keeping us from going live called What Works. But all these studies that are sponsored, I mean, there's 120 peer-reviewed journals, articles that came from it. So, I mean, if you do a little research, And if the person asks a question wants some names, I can give you some names and citations that'll take you there, and I think they'll answer.
The question was also about how do we shift the norms? How do we change the public understanding? Not just how do we know what we know, but how also do we
good
change
question.
the public understanding?
I think the question really is, or the answer is, we need to create a norm for the very first time. We have none. Clearly, we have none for how we treat people. And it's not just overseas, folks. It's here in the United States. The Innocence Project clears around, well, several hundred DNA exonerations that they help facilitate every year. Fully 26% have some false confession element to it. You know, it's abysmal. I often share that statistic talking about it being in China, and people say that's awful and it's to be expected of that type of government. Then I say, oh, excuse me, that was the United States. People don't know that. So the problem isn't just out there. The problem is right here. Wow. Yeah, I think it needs an evidence base, just like you have in medicine. You have an evidence base. People can't just say, do this. Why? Because I've been doing it for 27 years, 15 years, 50 years. No, you have to have some evidence. You have to have empirical research linked up with field validation studies and informed by practitioners like a Mark Fallon to put it in proper context. But you know, the average, the practice is dismal. And why did we go down this way? Well, the standard right now for the United States government, thanks to the National Defense Authorization Act of 2016, is the Army Field Manual, which I might add has never been examined. In fact, I wrote a paper that with a couple other people, it got suppressed. Mm-hmm. But the science is lacking for all these strategies. But yet, that's what we have to use. And forgive me, because I have absolutely no passion for this topic, and I'm probably just that neutral affect of mine.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Kleinman.
Thank you.
For
Thank you.